Welcome everyone to the Q&A session for the 10-day Loving Kindness Challenge, a community offering from Sounds True and Sharon Salzberg. You have been following along the whole time, then welcome. You are new. If you're new to the challenge and you wish to engage further, you'll be able to find all 10 videos on this playlist. Okay. Okay, let me get my technical business here together. I had the window open for the challenge itself. Anyway, I want to introduce you to our featured teacher today, and that is Sharon Salzberg, who's going to be joining us from New York City. Sharon is a world-renowned teacher of mindfulness and meditation, loving kindness, and compassion practice. Sharon is also a co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society and the Bar Center for Buddhist Studies. Sharon's also the author of several books, including the recently released book that's titled Real Change. Sharon, thank you for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice to be here.
All right, so you're going to get us started with a practice, I believe, before we launch into the many questions that we've been receiving in the past few days. Is that correct?
That's right. I thought we would start. Uh, Actually, let's start with a kind of foundational practice of just gathering our energy and arriving more fully. And I'll
Wonderful.
weave a little loving kindness into there. So, if you want to sit comfortably, eyes open or closed, however you feel most at ease. We'll start with just take a few deep breaths. Allow the breath to fill your body and then release. Then you can allow the breath to become natural. You don't have to try to make it deeper or different. And the operative word is rest. We're just going to rest our attention on the feeling of the breath. And if for some reason the breath doesn't work for you as this kind of central object, then some other sensation in your body, like your hands touching or your hands touching your knees or whatever, but something that's already happening that you don't need to fabricate. Let's say it's the breath. It's just resting your attention lightly, like a butterfly might rest upon a flower. And see if you can feel one breath without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath. Just this one. And if sounds or images or sensations or emotions should arise, see if you can let them flow on by as you rest your attention on the breath. You can let them come, let them go. You don't have to follow after them, and you don't have to fight them. Just rest, just breathe. And for all those perhaps many times when you're just gone, lost in thought, spun out in a fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. See if you can let go gently just whenever you become aware that you've been distracted. And with some kindness towards yourself, bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath. Instead of judging yourself or berating yourself, here's the moment when we have the chance to be really different. We see we've been distracted, we let go, and we start over. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze and we'll end the meditation. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Sharon. I so appreciate that because at the start of the day, it felt like I was just like stumbling to keep up and just hold all the things on my plate. And even at the start of this session and having too many windows open or fumbling over the script, there are things that I was wanting to hold on to in that practice, and just that permission to let it go, let the judgments go, and just come back, keep coming back, and your guidance to just be entirely different in a moment. That was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so let's get to these questions that we've got. Lots of them coming in. And let's just start with the one that comes from Ada, who is in East Bay, California, who asks, what have you found to be in bringing equanimity into volatile situations? And for example, I'm thinking of times when fear seems to restrict my access to options. And can you also share what equanimity is, by the way?
Sure. Well, I think fear, almost by definition, means our options are restricted because our view is restricted. And I should also try to make a distinction between feeling something like fear and being overpowered by fear because we feel what we feel. I'm not in my home in Massachusetts right now where I happen to have a collection of cups that people have made for me with sayings that I use, like, we feel what we feel. And, so I can't flash it to the camera, but, rather than feeling I shouldn't have fear and I should be over this by now and I've worked so hard and why is there still fear? We feel what we feel, but how we relate to those feelings is everything. Do we take something to heart? Do we identify with it? Do we think like we're the only one, whoever feels this, or this is going to last forever? Or can we more have that sense of, oh, this is passing through? So I'll take your question as being more overcome by fear, because that's when our vision really gets restricted. And there's simply things we don't remember, that it's not only A or B, perhaps, maybe there's a C, D, E, and F option, but it's like we can't see it in that moment. And so what we want to do is we can't dispel the fear necessarily, but we want to create enough space so that we have a different relationship to it and always be kind to ourselves in the face of it. Interestingly enough, in terms of the Buddhist tradition, they say the Buddha taught loving kindness is the antidote to fear. And so that's another possibility is, because fear or anxiety is such a high energy state, it's taking that energy and channeling it into care for ourselves or for someone else. In terms of equanimity, that's a tough word to define. My first teacher was S.N. Goenka. This was an intensive 10-day retreat in India where I began meditating. This was in January of 1971. And Goenka used to go around all the time saying, be equanimous, be equanimous, be equanimous. And we used to whisper to one another, is that a word? Like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, So that's an even stranger form of the word, but equanimity in itself, it means balance. And it can imply to us something dull or indifferent or not caring, cut off in a way. And it doesn't mean that at all. It's the balance born of wisdom. So it's like perspective. It's, for example, equanimity combined with compassion makes for maybe trying to help out a friend, but not becoming codependent, right? Because the compassion has us care and try to be of help. And the wisdom tells us it's not up to me in the end, like the universe is not in my hands to control, sad to say, So uh, equanimity is the voice of wisdom. It's bringing wisdom into any situation. And I also, there's another aspect of equanimity, which I really talk about a lot these days. It's very meaningful to me. Um, and it can be expressed as having a spacious enough mind and heart so we can hold many things at the same time, like the joy and the sorrow, the immediate situation, which for some people is very bad, and a sense of possibility or a vision of change. You know, it's really it's about space and being able to hold many things at once. So it started, the current incarnation of it is a meaningful thing for me. Started a few years ago when I was teaching in Parkland, Florida for the first time with a community that had survived a school shooting. And one of the women at the workshop, her mom is a teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and she was there that day of the shooting, but she wasn't harmed. But uh, the Samantha, the woman, had gotten very involved with the current students and helping arrange a march and all of that. And so at one point, Samantha raised her hand and she said, I feel really weird because I'm having this incredible time learning these tools and being here with everybody and being here with you. But I know the only reason it's happening is because that horrible thing happened. And I don't know how to get over that in order to enjoy this. And I said in response, I don't know that we ever get over it, but we learn to hold them both at once. So that story is in my book, Real Change, my most recent book. And when the book was coming out in early September, I did a series of panels and stuff, which are now up on YouTube. And Samantha was on one of the panels. I did a whole panel with Parkland survivors. And I said, Samantha, remember that story? Remember when we talked about equanimity? And she said, not only do I remember it, I think about it every single day of my life. And it's become that important to her, you know, that it just guides her in some way. And that's what I think it really is. You know, it's not indifference or not caring, but life's pretty big, actually. And we can have a heart or mind as big.
Certainly appropriate for our current challenges. Can you talk a little bit? I want to back up to talk about this 10-day challenge. Why now? And what do you want people to get from it?
Well, this was really, you know, a lot the brainchild of Tami Simon, you know, who's the founder of Sounds True,
Mhm.
who's like kind of an incredible visionary. I've always felt that. I remember sitting in Tammy's car like a long time ago, it seems to me, and she held up a CD and she said, see this? They're going to disappear. I said, really? You know, like when I first did a product for Tammy, it was a cassette tape, you know,
Mhm.
that's how long ago it was. The thought that you know, the CD was going to go. Like, what?
Mhm.
But she just said, you know, this time before the U.S. election, the presidential election, and everything else that's happening, it's a time of tremendous anxiety for people. And you know, I was thinking that I recorded these some years ago. She said, "Why don't we do a challenge? You know, of loving kindness?" And he was the Buddha saying, love is or loving kindness is the antidote to fear." And people are so anxious and dismayed and despairing. It's just such a difficult time. So let's just do a challenge and offer it. And that was great. So here we are.
Hmm. All right. This one comes from Linda from Austin, Texas, who writes, if my truth is I don't like everybody, ahem, current POTUS, how do I move forward with love and grace when it's so obvious that people's expressions can be so hurtful to the soul? How do you also love family members who support hurt? I don't accept it as their karma. I do I accept it as their karma and allow it or speak my truth to them?
Okay, so there's a lot in there. So I'll try to unpack that. I see loving kindness as an inner state. It's a state of the heart. it doesn't mandate a certain kind of action. And that's what a lot of people fear. They say, well, were I to develop a more loving heart, I can only be sweet. I can only say yes. I can only give them more money. I can only let them move back in. I can only be meek. I can only let other people be hurt, because I'm just sort of loving, and it's a state of the heart out of which the action that we take is born of discernment and awareness and situational awareness and cultural awareness and things like that. Like we know there's such a thing as tough love, for example, right? Out of a
Mhm.
truly, genuinely loving heart, you might decide some circumstance, some particular relationship, some moment in time, the best way you can act is to have a strong boundary or to be really fierce, to be really intense. It's not denying the love that's in your heart. It's saying, wisdom is telling me, contextual wisdom is telling me, as far as I can tell, and it's like a guess sometimes, but as far as I can tell, this is the most appropriate way to act in this moment in time with this person. And so to cultivate loving kindness is not mandating that you be sweet, or
Mhm.
that you give in or you acquiesce. That's part of it. Part of it is understanding, what do we mean by loving kindness? Because it actually doesn't mean liking everybody. It may not mean liking anybody, but it's kind of a deep sense within that our lives have something to do with one another, and that our lives are interrelated. That's the nature of the universe, and that one of the things that connects us is that everybody actually wants to be happy. Everybody. And not happy in a superficial, petty sense, but really like a sense of belonging. Everybody wants a sense of being at home somewhere in his body, in his mind, with one another on this planet. And it's because of the force of ignorance that we're so misguided. The myths we've been told and the stories and things we've been led to believe about where happiness is to be found. And so we can recognize that and still have this sense of connection because everybody does want to be happy. And another thing that unites us is that everybody is so vulnerable to change, to loss. It's not at all that we suffer in the same amounts one another as one another, but that vulnerability, the fact that life can change on a dime. It's like, look where we are.
Mhm.
I'm fond of telling this story now. I had to look up somebody's email address. So I was like going through all my old emails, and the last time they wrote to me was New Year's Eve. And it was all like, I can't wait for 2020. 2019 hasn't been that easy. It's going to be so great. We get to 2020 just a few hours from now. And I was like, oh, God.
Mm.
So
Right.
we do share that vulnerability. And so we can have it's a sense of recognition that this is the nature of things, but it has nothing to do with liking people. And it certainly has nothing to do with not speaking frankly or not working hard against someone's agenda if you think they're causing harm. And sometimes I think if you're talking about a political leader, as many people are these days, it's not a gushy kind of love, but sometimes there is a feeling of compassion. I actually do feel some compassion, which I don't think weakens us. I think it makes us stronger, like, because I think, what a life choice, like I thought, what would it be like to make choices in your life so that if it was announced you had a terminal disease, all these people would rejoice. And you think, really? Is that what you want to dedicate your life to? That smallness, that meanness? And the answer for some people is yes, but like, really? And so I do feel that because I think our potential as human beings is so much greater than that. But if you get lost in disconnection and ignorance, it's going to look much more like that. And I actually think that's a painful state.
Jan writes, what advice do you give to people who are lonely during these uncertain times and in isolation? When it is difficult to see family and friends, that have no support system?
It's tough, but there's, I kept reading even before the pandemic that there was an epidemic of loneliness, and some of it seemed to be born of kind of social institutions that were places we used to congregate, maybe not playing as powerful a role. There's this great book, which has a fantastic title called Bowling Alone. That's a dissolution of bowling leagues. And just different elements of society, different ways we'd come together were not happening. Or for some people, churches and synagogues were not as prominent in their lives as maybe a generation ago. It's different for everybody, but um, and as things were falling apart in that way, loneliness was very prevalent anyway. And I kept thinking, as I would hear say about the powerful role of social connection and healing in different clinical situations, it can't be a numbers game, like where you have some illness and you think, well, I only have 2 friends, I better get 8 more. It must be an inner sense of being connected to all of life. So that's precisely what loving kindness does. So that's part of my suggestion, is that you consider taking up a practice like loving kindness, because I think it makes a profound difference from within. And the other thing I would say is see where you can help somebody, see where you can reach out. Like I've heard that story so many times since March, where people say in New York City would say to me, I've lived in this apartment for 12 years. I never even knew my neighbors' names. Now we all have everyone's name and phone number in case somebody gets into trouble and we have to help one another. Maybe it was most pronounced in New York because it was so bad here. But I've heard that some version of that story so many times. Or, I chose this one elderly neighbor to check on, things like that. And I think it makes a big difference.
Teresa from Cambridge writes, I know you must get this question all the time, but sometimes I find it the most difficult to direct loving kindness toward myself. It feels like something is not allowing me. How can I be my own friend?
Um, I do get that question all the time.
Mm,
And the great irony is that if you have been doing the challenge or you're familiar with loving kindness practice, you know that it's sort of an arc, it's a structure of slowly growing the sense of care and inclusion, until you reach all beings everywhere, all of life. And the underlying principle of the practice is said to be to do it in the easiest way possible. So that's what's supposed to determine that structure. And the first place you start, because it's supposed to be easiest, is yourself. So that is the great irony, because for so many people, we're not the easiest person. And so, just in deference to that underlying principle, I always say, put yourself in later. Don't fret about needing to be the first, uh, but do put yourself in there somewhere. And people, it's also a practice where you can have some fun, and be creative and just enjoy yourself. So people have told me things like, I didn't really do loving kindness for myself until I got to all beings everywhere. And then I would pop up like a pop-up ad in the computer, like, me too, or there are ways of practicing where you imagine a benefactor, somebody who embodies love for you, and they're offering you loving kindness. And you may feel creepy, or whatever you feel, but we let those emotions wash through us as we steady our attention on that act of receiving. I think it will make a difference. And what's very hard for a lot of people about this practice is that you won't see the difference, most likely, in your formal practice. You just won't. Um, we all want that great breakthrough moment. It was like, oh, 9:15, I love myself completely. Never went back from that. But much more likely, you're going to think nothing's happening, honestly. But if you notice in your life so hard to use an example now because everything's different. But, if you make a mistake, how long and how harshly do you chastise yourself before you can let go and start over? You'll see a difference. Or you meet a stranger and you feel all self conscious and weird, you'll see a difference. Or meeting adversity and feeling like it's only you will see a difference. You definitely will see a difference. Probably my signature story about loving kindness was, I first heard about that particular method of meditation in 1971. When I first heard about meditation practice or started meditation practice in this mindfulness course that S.N. Goenka was teaching, where he did like maybe half an hour of loving kindness right at the end. It was sort of like a ceremonial way of saying goodbye. And I was really intrigued by it, but I never had a teacher to kind of bring me through the whole structure of it in depth until 1985 when I went to Burma and I did a 3-month retreat in loving kindness. But in between those two dates in 1976, we opened up the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, and we had a month before there was any programming. So I thought, you know what, I have a month. I've always wanted to do loving kindness meditation. I don't have a teacher here to guide me, but I know by now how to do it. You start with yourself and you move through these different categories till you get to all the beings. So I thought I'll do loving kindness for a month. And so I spent the first week just doing loving kindness for myself, and I felt absolutely nothing. It was like a completely dreary week. And then at the end of the week, something happened to like one of our friends, our community members in Boston. So several of us had to suddenly leave the retreat. So I was getting ready to go. And I was upstairs in one of the bathrooms when I dropped this big jar of something, which just like went down and shattered on the tile floor. And I can remember the very first thought that came up in my mind was, you are really a klutz, but I love you. And I thought, look at that.
Hmm.
Could have given me anything in the course of the week, and I could not have honestly said something was happening, but something was happening. So if you want to make the experiment, if you have that kind of interest or willingness, do the practice. You don't have to offer loving kindness to yourself first, but somewhere in the arc of a session, include yourself. And even if you feel nothing, do not worry about it, because you will definitely see changes.
Mhm. And Samantha has a related question. I'm wondering whether you have a different response for this. She asks, when I try to practice loving kindness toward myself, I'm flooded with feelings of shame. How can I work with this?
Many people would cast or characterize meditation practice as a purification process. So, from that point of view, sometimes the arising of all these feelings, if you can let them, it's like a storm, a weather storm moving through your body. If you can let it come and go, it's actually kind of a release. It's when we stop it, and say, this is a worthy feeling. I am the worst person that ever lived, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or as one of my teachers, this Tibetan teacher once said, it's not the thought that's the problem, it's the glue. So this is not easy, and it takes usually some training, it takes some skill, but um, the shame and all those things, they're also kind of interesting, like uh, it often comes up in that exercise I suggested where you position yourself in the role of the recipient and somebody else is offering loving kindness to you. Sometimes even worse, it's done with a circle. You imagine like a circle of loving beings and you're in the center and they're all offering loving kindness to you. So I remember my predominant feeling was I just wanted to duck down and have them offer loving kindness to one another, like forget me. So it's not uncommon and it's not even that bad, really. It can be good because it can be like a release, but you have to let it release, and so when things feel overwhelming, whatever it is, shame, fear, whatever it is, then take a little break. Do something easier. In other words, you don't have to take a break from the meditation if you don't want to, but uh, my benefactor these days, we start with offering love and kindness to ourselves, and then we move to somebody uh, who's either helped us directly or inspired us from afar or just makes us smile when we think of them. So my benefactor these days is this puppy I know, because my friends adopted a puppy and the family just seems like so much happier than they were before. So I just move on to the puppy. Go to something
Mhm.
that's easier. It's really fine.
Okay. Is there a dynamic aspect to loving kindness practice? This comes from Kit in Louisiana. So, using the imagination to creatively create new energies from within and without, because you just spoke about using visualization to imagine yourself as
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
recipient, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the core understandings of any meditation process um, is that we're developing and cultivating different strengths or different qualities at the same time. And one whole side of those qualities are things like greater peace and calm and tranquility and relaxation. And another whole side of those qualities is energy and connection and um, aliveness and so on. And so our goal in the end is to try to bring them into some balance. And so it's very striking in loving kindness practice. We create a structure so that we can more easily concentrate. We use certain phrases. We repeat the phrases, We're not trying to think of new phrases all the time. There are 3 or 4 phrases, not 15. Because somebody once came to me and said, I can't remember my phrases. So I said, well, how many do you have? And they said about 15. And I said, well, no one can remember 15 phrases, So you're going
Mhm.
to sit there thinking, what comes next? And you're going to lose the concentration. The general rule is the simpler things are, the more repeated they are, the more structured they are, the easier it's going to be to concentrate. So that's that whole tranquility side of things that we need to cultivate. It's a little tricky in loving kindness practice because when we bring someone to mind, they're an actual being, person or puppy or something. Like we're not asked to create a composite picture of, say, a homeless person to offer loving kindness to. If we're offering loving kindness to a homeless person, we know them, or we've talked to them, or we've seen them written up in a newspaper. They're a real being. And relationships are complicated. If you think of a benefactor, not the puppy who's perfect, but often people will say something like, well, I was offering loving kindness to my benefactor and everything was going well. And then I realized, oh, there was that one time I called you. You weren't really there for me. Maybe you're not my benefactor. Maybe you're my difficult person. And, life is like that. Relationships are complicated. And so in loving kindness practice, it's very easy just to tell endless stories. And so I really, partly because of my tendency to do that, I really treasure the structure, the simplicity, the repetition, using the form, using the phrases. But you don't want to be imprisoned by that because we also need the other side. We need the energy and the aliveness and the connection. And that's where we use active imagination. Maybe it's visualization, trying to get a much cleaner sense of the recipient, or maybe it's imagining them happy. What would that look like? Or in the case of loving kindness for a difficult person, one of the things the Buddhist text talks about is like, imagine this person that you really don't like as an infant, as helpless to the actions of others as any infant, or imagine them dying, in the sense that after all this, like all the grievances and all the actions and all the mistakes, we all have to let go of everything. Think of that. So we extrapolate from that. Is there any circumstance that you can imagine in which it might be easier just to offer loving kindness to this person than other circumstances. And that doesn't mean you're waiting for this great rush of feeling either, but at least it's possible to continue the practice. So people say things like, I put my difficult person on this island, no boat, no way in the world they could get to me. This food, like I'm not trying to starve them, but they can never get to me. Then I could do loving kindness for them. So we play in all kinds of different ways, and it's good.
Mm. Alex writes from Denver, I find it easy to wish well to others when they're struggling, but when they're experiencing success, I shut down or experience intense envy. How do I celebrate others' successes?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, as you know, I'm sure we talk about four qualities all together that are kind of this bundle. And the first is loving kindness, that acknowledgement of connection. The second is compassion. I don't know what's happening in the streets of New York, but something. The second is compassion with our hearts moved in relationship to somebody's suffering or vulnerability. The third quality is called sympathetic joy, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's having happiness for someone else's happiness rather than feeling so jealous or envious. And then the fourth quality is equanimity, which we talked about already. So they really are kind of a bundle. And of those four qualities, I've heard several teachers say that the most difficult for many people is sympathetic joy. Like if we can kind of get that someone's suffering, even if they don't look that way on the surface, we may well feel compassion. But to really feel joy in someone else's happiness is a trip, Not for
Hmm.
everybody. I mean, I feel like I know people who just have that naturally. It's like they're celebrating something. Something good happens for you and they're so happy for you. And it's so exciting, for them. And it's so beautiful. And where other people, they may smile, but they don't seem that happy that something good is happening for you. And it feels so terrible. For most of us, it is a kind of training in that, ooh,
Hmm.
they're almost gone.
It's
New York
happening. It is.
wouldn't
It's
happen if I was in
happening.
Massachusetts, I'll tell you.
It's not happening here in Denver, but I'm glad it's happening somewhere.
One of the things about sympathetic joy is that we get to look at the assumptions that lead us to envy or jealousy.
Hmm.
Like happiness is a limited commodity in this world, and the more someone else has, the less is going to be for me. So it's this notion of scarcity and this very complex one of you have everything and you will forever. And I have nothing and I will forever. So there are a few problems with that. First of all, of course, nothing is forever.
Hmm.
And second of all, it's unlikely I have nothing, like absolutely nothing. I may have nothing much I appreciate or nothing much I pay attention to, but it's unlikely I have absolutely nothing. It's also unlikely you have absolutely everything. And that's one of the places where we start to work. It would actually be a gratitude practice that we do very consciously, not to try to force the jealousy or envy away, but to counter it, because it's based on a certain mistaken notion, a series of mistaken notions. And so we're going to challenge them. And we start with a gratitude practice so that we don't feel so empty, and needy, as though we had nothing going. And
Hmm.
it makes a very big difference, even just to start there. And then remember, nothing is forever. And you actually wouldn't feel that good, crowing over somebody's fall.
Hmm.
You wouldn't. And so, uh, but start with the gratitude practice.
That really is a bundle, isn't it? Just hearing you speak about um, how we might cultivate genuine joy for someone else by working with gratitude, and then not also not judging ourselves for
Yeah,
what we're feeling, and being kind to ourselves in the process as we grow into more loving
yeah,
kindness.
yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
essential. I'd also say, I think there's a strong cultural conditioning in sort of mainstream American society. And I don't know how many people are tuning in from other countries, for example, but it's almost like a culture of disparagement, which I've been thinking about and talking about for a while. It's like we're almost taught that we'll feel better about ourselves by putting other people down. And you can hear it in the way we converse. You can hear it. You can see it a lot in entertainment. It's like I don't watch reality TV actually, but occasionally I was at a friend's house. We don't do that right now. I would be at a friend's house and they turn something on. So somebody turned on this cooking show once, and I was horrified by it. Because instead of the judges saying, "Well, that souffle was good, but it could have used more nutmeg or something," they say, "Take your knives and go. Like you are not worthy of being alive," and that's supposed to be entertaining, and it is entertaining for people. And it's like, whoa. So we have some crazy conditioning about this too, and I think realizing that, oh, maybe I'll try appreciating people a little bit and thanking people and see what that does.
Mhm. Christy writes in from Houston, how do I balance a loving kindness practice with anger at injustice? Can I use loving kindness to fuel action and activism as well?
Yes. And again, I think we feel what we feel, and you shouldn't put down your anger or say it's wrong. You shouldn't feel it. That's not the point. But it's a complex feeling. And if we get overwhelmed by it and it becomes more like a chronic state, as many activists would say, it in the Buddhist psychology, anger is likened to a forest fire which burns up its own support. So if it becomes chronic, if it consumes us, it can literally consume us, our relationships, our whole way of being. When I was writing Real Change, I thought, oh, you know what? I want to find that Gandhi quote where he said something like, if we're lost in anger, and again, I want to differentiate just feeling anger from being overcome by it. But something like, if we're lost in anger, it's like drinking poison, thinking it's going to kill the other guy. So when I looked it up, because I had to source it in order to put it in the book, I never saw it attributed to Gandhi. I saw it attributed to the Buddha and Oprah Winfrey and the Big Book of AA and Carrie Fisher and Nelson
Mm,
Mandela and a few other people. I have no idea who said it, but it's
mhm,
actually a great quotation. Because that's the point. You don't want to disparage your anger, but let's look at what happens when it's overwhelming. And again, it's a state where options disappear and we're on fire. And it's such a telling example in this time when so many states are on fire. Like, not only does anger have the potential of destroying the host, like a fire, it can range very far. We might end up far from where we want to be. And so it's not a very effective tool, actually, for correcting injustice, for example, although it may be the thing that got us to get up and try, and motivated us to start, which is important. Um, and yes, loving kindness, more like, well, loving kindness in one way and compassion in another way, can be and are tremendous motivations for seeking change. Loving kindness and mindfulness together give us a vision that is true, which is how interconnected our lives are. And the ways we normally relate as self and other and us and them are just constructs. And the world doesn't work that way. I mean, look at a pandemic. Like, why did we think it was going to stay somewhere else? It's not the way things work. Or I can remember years ago with the terrible series of events happening at Fukushima in Japan, culminating in like the nuclear incident there.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading these pieces from the foreign press, and in this case, it was a headline in French, and I wasn't reading it in French, which I'm incapable of, but it was a French newspaper, um, and the headline said something like "radioactive material blowing across the Pacific due to fortuitous winds." And I thought, yeah, maybe they're fortuitous if you're in France, but if you're in Seattle, it doesn't really bode very well. And besides, don't we believe the earth is round anymore? Like, can't it go around the other side? Interdependence is just the truth of life. And the more we pay attention, the more we see that. It's not romantic or sentimental, it's actually how things are. And so that leads us to a sense of energy and commitment and realizing that, yes, we can work for the betterment, for the greater good um, of not only ourselves but others, and that it's really like a unified field, and that's important. And compassion, I think, really um, opens that door to having a sense of finding one another because we are all so vulnerable. Sometimes people think of compassion as a kind of hierarchical state, like I up here, whose life is so perfect, and bestowing this kindness on you down there because your life has fallen apart, which mine never could. Well, guess what? It could.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really find each other in compassion, and there can be a great urgency about trying to help ease suffering in some way on any level, personal or systemic. Whatever we understand as our way to contribute. And um, but so it's some balance in there. Don't disparage the anger you feel. Notice if it really starts consuming you. Realize you have alternatives.
Mm-hmm. There are so many, speaking of interrelatedness, there are so many questions that seem to dovetail into each other about experiencing the challenge growing a loving kindness, cultivating a practice of loving kindness, and also instilling a sense of compassion for the self while we're at it. So, can you talk a little bit about how we can support ourselves? Because I'm also thinking of the analogy of the fires burning up their own support, and our difficult emotions burning up our own foundation, right, that we're working from. So, how would you advise we cultivate a practice of loving kindness when we're also experiencing the rising awareness of these old internalized stories and beliefs about maybe our exceptionalism or the hierarchical so-called nature of who we are, in addition to the challenges from without, politics, pandemic, and so on?
Well, I think the first thing I would do, and it seems maybe a little elementary, but it's actually very powerful, is to reframe what we're experiencing. So if we have fear or whatever may be arising, instead of calling it bad or wrong or weak or incorrect, call it what it is, which is painful. It's suffering. It's a state of suffering, especially if we get lost in it. And most especially if we act from it, if it's guiding our choices and our decisions. And so too with anger, with greed, with many of these states. Um, they're very painful states if we are entangled in them. And to recognize that, it's like our whole grid of assessment changes. It's not good and bad and right and wrong. It's that which leads to suffering and that which leads to the end of suffering, connection, freedom, and so on. So that's the first thing I would do. Because if we're calling them bad or wrong and thinking I should have, gotten over this long ago, I've been meditating for like almost 50 years. I've been in therapy forever, spent all that money, I shouldn't have this anymore. It's not going to work. It's just not an effective way of relating to these states. And it actually only makes it worse. Um, at the same time, if they're just leading us around, we have no perspective, we have no centering, we're not going to learn much about them either. We're just going to keep acting out. And so um, we just want to create enough space so we can pay attention to these feelings and enough kindness so that we see them for what they are, which is really painful states. And I think it's very important because most people, when they hear a term like self-compassion, I find can equate it with laziness or not having standards of excellence or being too lenient in terms of how you behave, things like that. But
Mhm.
actually, it's apparently the most potent way to make a change or learn something new or change a habit or make progress in something is to have some compassion for yourself. And research is showing this. And part of that is just recognizing a sense of common humanity. You've blown it. You made a mistake. And it's not like self-esteem, which might come up like, wow, I learned tennis. Wow, I learned this, It's like self-compassion comes up when we've blown it, when we've made a mistake or we've done something we didn't really want to do, in the bigger picture. And we have to realize this is part of the human condition, that we can't hold ourselves to unreal standards of like never making a mistake. And how we bounce back, how we come back is really much more to the point than not having blown it to begin with. And so we just use these various ways of instilling more kindness toward ourselves.
Mhm. And there was a question earlier on about directing loving kindness to people who have passed on. This is from Janet in Seattle. And I wanted to go to this one because you did mention visualization or the perfect puppy and extending loving kindness to those who are no longer living. She asks, what does it mean to repeat the phrases happy and healthy, etc., for people who are passed on?
Yeah, it's a little bit complex a question because if you look at this technique as embedded in the Buddhist cosmology, for example, where they believe very strongly in rebirth, um, they would say, and they do say, that offering loving kindness to someone who has died is, or the strongest connection beyond time, beyond space, beyond this body is our own good heartedness. And so offering loving kindness would be an example of something where they believe in rebirth. They believe that being is somewhere, and so you actually can use those phrases. Now, obviously, many of us, if not most of us, don't have that belief. And so we're operating with a very different kind of worldview. In which case, if you offer loving kindness to someone who's died, it's almost more an honoring of them sometimes, and you find the words, or no words, whatever's working for you. But it's kind of commemorating their place in your life and um, their having played that role in some way, maybe saying thank you or whatever it might
Mhm.
be. And so you can either find the words that make sense or really just hold them in your heart, and it works the same way.
Mhm. I'm imagining too whether it might be something along the lines of forgiveness
Hmm.
in order to move on in this life so that it really gives to us as much, if not more, than to that person who has passed on.
Yeah,
Is that?
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And this comes from Vicky in Louisville, who asks, I have a hard time getting in touch with what my body is feeling. And can you talk about why that is so important, being in touch with the body?
Well, a lot of people would say that, so you're definitely not alone. And I wouldn't make it a project, like I've got to get in touch with my body or I'll never make progress. I don't think that's true at all. But it can be really useful in a number of different ways. First of all, when old patterns arise, they often arise first in the body, and you can recognize something there even before the thoughts form. And thoughts, of course, can be very fleeting. Um, so, for example, I have a friend who said she was the kind of person who could never say no. And so, what she did once in her meditation was she brought up in her mind those kind of scenarios where she would be asked the kind of question where she had such a hard time saying no. And she felt what was happening in her body. This kind of panic was arising in her stomach. It was very visceral, like, oh, they won't like me, And so she got a hit of that sensation. So that became her feedback system when she was at work or in some situation. She was asked that very kind of question, and she'd feel that very thing. That was her signal to say, I'll have to get back to you on that. So she couldn't bring herself to say no right away, but she could say, I need a little time. And then later she could say no. So that's one reason. Another reason is that um, it's kind of related, is that so much is held in our body awareness. And being more in touch with it will reveal that. And sometimes when like something we do with all emotional states in meditation is we pivot, because mostly if we feel a strong emotion, our fascination, our interest is with the object, the story, the circumstance, and we pivot to look at the emotion itself. It's like if you're filled with anger, what we're most interested in is what brought it about and the provocation and what they did. And we don't usually turn our attention around and say, what does it feel like to be angry? What does anger feel like? But that's what we do in meditation. And the beginning of that is, what does it feel like in my body? Because it's just easier, and then we move on to like, what's the anger movie? Like, what other strands of feeling are in here? Maybe sadness, maybe fear, all kinds of things. So, but that's just more subtle and therefore more demanding. So we start with the body.
Mhm. Sharon, before we close, do you have any final notes that you'd like to leave us with? Or in particular, how would you like to see us incorporate these practices into daily life? Because I know some folks have said, it's been very hard to practice during this pandemic. I'm so anxious and just
Yeah.
hard to be still.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can suit the posture to your energy level. You can walk and do loving kindness. Even if you're walking back and forth in your apartment, and just find a way. I think it's so beautiful a technique, especially for anxiety and fear and kind of feeling unworthy. I've just seen it. It's very powerful. It actually works, but you have to kind of give it a try and give it a try for a little bit of time and see where that leads you.
All right. You heard it here, everyone. Thank you so much, Sharon Salzberg, for spending this time with us and for helping us get into the Loving Kindness Challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And it's our hope that you can use this challenge as an opportunity to cultivate loving kindness in your own life, even during these oddly challenging times. We would like to encourage you to use your practice to have a positive ripple effect in the world. And that includes by voting. Sounds true. Can you see Sharon nodding here? Yes.
Gotta vote.
Gotta vote. Gotta vote. For Sounds True, I'm Christy Peoples signing off with Sharon Salzberg. waking up the world.